Welcome to the Concast. I'm former dishwasher, failed musician, and absurdist writer John Conrath. On today's show, we talked to longtime friend Andrea Donderi, a recent graduate of the MFA Program for writers at Warren Wilson College. And we'll save the UFO stuff for last, I guess. We'll get into that. So, going back, because when we first met, when was it?
93, maybe?
93, 94, yeah, 93.
I think it was 93.
Yeah,
It was
because...
the year of Easy Mail.
Yeah. So, yeah, Indiana University. We both worked in the support center.
I was doing email, pretty much all subjects. Anything that anybody wrote in an email question about, I would answer, along with 3 other nutty people.
And this was it wasn't pre-internet, but it was
It was very early on.
Pre-web.
The web was just emerging. It was that Christmas that I remember deciding I'd better get a graphical browser and look at the Hermitage Museum site online.
They had a site?
They had the Hermitage Museum was one of the first interesting graphical sites that existed. And up to that point, we were just all using links,
Yeah. I'm trying to think of what the first real graphical site, because I was pretty enmeshed in Usenet news, and we used to get images from, what was a big Washington University, UNC had that one, sunsite.unc, and I just remember going on there and downloading one picture of the space shuttle, 640 by 480, 256 colors, and it would take you 20 minutes on campus or something, and you look at it, and it's like, wow, this almost looks like a photo.
But it was a big deal to get, mosaic and look at pictures online without having to download anything.
Yeah, and it was also, I think we were kind of on the forefront of, right around then, every browser would go to UIUC's page.
That's right.
Or a lot of them would, and then UIUC would have a link to every website in existence. So it would, all 38 of them or something. And it would all be Joe's Cup of Coffee website.
That's right.
Or whatever. And most websites, if you were at IU and you had a website, you weren't necessarily producing content. You would just have a thing of Here are 10 things I like. Yeah, here's
links to 10 things I like.
Here are the 6 things I found on the web, and here are the links to them, and it's all text, and it's all whatever. But I remember when we were at the support center, there was the whole beginning of the knowledge base.
That's right. And
that was actual content that people would do, and had a function other than just looking at stuff, because, it was almost two-directional in that you had a search box, and you would enter in.
You would enter in something that you wanted to know about, and if anyone had ever written to us, that is to the Indiana University Support Center, about that topic, any roughly technical topic that people had questions about, we would try to answer, and we would put them up. We would put them up online for people who wanted to read them.
And it was the beginning of content creation for us, because I remember I was doing the zine stuff, and I was when we would be sitting around, and you worked on email, I worked on answering the phone, and sometimes we'd get slammed with dumb questions, beginning of the semester, August, and all that. But there were other times where I would just be sitting there thinking, what can I make a web page of, and what can I get an idea of what to do? And I thought, I'll just do some music reviews, or do, I had this thing for a while where I really wanted to make a choose your own adventure book that, you would have, you're in the dungeon, there's a whatever, do you go left or right? You click on left and it opens another page. But, the only authoring tool was, VI.
Right. But that worked fine. We all did it.
Yeah. But I think that was the first, that was my first lesson in having the tools doesn't necessarily mean you have the idea to do it. Or, it's like buying, just because you buy a blank, nice little journal, it doesn't mean that
you actually have anything to say.
Yeah. And that was my situation, was I had all these nice blank little journals and nice pens to write in them, but I had no ideas. So that lasted about a week.
But the point that you made earlier is interesting about how even then a lot of what was considered content creation was really just aggregations of other things. And that a year or two before I hit Bloomington, I hung out in Chicago with some people from Shynet, and one of them one of them was that nutbar Jorn Barger.
Oh yeah, didn't he invent the word blog?
He did.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about him is I realized years later he was the first person who mentioned to me the possibility of hypertext markup. And this was a couple of years before it actually this was a couple of years before things actually got started. I don't know why I was talking to Jorn on the phone, but I was, for some reason, and we were just talking about Gopher, which was what was around then at that point.
Yeah, and the support center used Gopher before it used the web.
That's
for
right.
like a year. Gopher was weird because I remember when it came up, and my friend Bill Perry was in, like, I think he might have been one of the people that showed it to me first, and it was so remarkable. But there was like some barred entry, like I think you had to be you had to be in the CS department, the person working on that server, to create content. Like you couldn't just go to a home directory and start dropping HTML files in. You had to be like the official affiliated.
Right, you had to be the administrator of the Gopher server.
Yeah, and because of that, there were only like so many official sites. Because when the web really started, anybody that had a machine sitting on a university network could start up an HTTP server and start dumping pages on it, and put up their land of Star Trek fan fiction or whatever they were into at that time. And but Gopher was like siloed off, so it was interesting, and it was interesting to go and see, like, oh, I'm looking at the University of Minnesota's computer science department, or I'm looking at NASA's list of planets, or I don't know what they had. NASA seemed to have stuff early on, but yeah, you couldn't create the content. And then when the web started, that's when it hit. But China, can you explain that a little bit? Because I know a little of the story.
I don't even remember that much about it, frankly. It was the guy who ran it, Randy Seuss, called it a public access Unix system. And it was basically just people had logins on Randy's machine. And he and another guy had founded apparently the first BBS many years before. A guy called Ward.
Was it like a bunch of modems that you dialed in, or was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I remember it was a very big deal when he got a satellite feed on the roof of his building.
Oh.
Because there was no more of those bang paths.
Oh yeah. So you could actually, it was probably like 56K or something, like 100th of what your cell phone has when it's on 2 bars on the 3G network and you're cursing at it.
But it worked fine for what it was at the time.
It was interesting because I remember right before the web, there was a handful of those. And China, it was weird because I always think of, when you would first talk about it, I always thought of like the plasticware.
Right, the dishes.
But it was CHIs and Chicago Net, which it took me a minute to... I think it wasn't until I met somebody else on ChiNet and started emailing with her that I realized,
it had nothing to do with it. It had nothing to do with picnic plates.
Exactly. But there were a few of those, like there was one at MS State, mars.ms state, and it's weird that I remember these URLs. I don't remember my own cell phone number, but I remember, like there was ISCA at Iowa State, and there were a couple others, but there was
something in Georgia too.
At GIT or one of those.
Gay Tech something, or Gay, I don't know what it was.
Yeah, but there were all these systems that if you weren't local, you would use Telnet. And this was all text-based. This was all, you're looking at an 80 by 25 screen and typing in these commands and stuff. But you could go there, you create a free account, and they would have like usually some kind of little chat thing where you go in and you could either talk to a wall of people typing little messages about whatever, trying to get laid, whatever they were doing. Or they would have like these bulletin board things that would be pages and pages of whatever political arguments or whatever Piers Anthony book they were reading at the time or whatever it was. It was always certain. It was funny how you drop one of those in any random state and the same conversations would come up of like, Tolkien and polyamory and, bad poetry and like,
I don't know what the deal was. I basically signed up because I wanted an email address and I wanted to be able to get
yeah.
email and Usenet, and I ended up meeting a whole lot of people through there, but that wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's that was because I went to the one party of a bunch of Chinet people that one weekend in
Oh,
Chicago.
that's right. I forgot about that. That was
And
years later.
yeah, and I guess it kind of ran its course at that point, but there were still the
I
people
think
that
so.
were.
I wasn't really around there anymore. I think we all got randomly invited by somebody whom I knew. I don't know, but anyway, I had pretty much stopped hanging out there by that point.
Yeah, and I mean that was whatever 93 or 94, but I think it was 94 I went up. But yeah, it was interesting how deep that community went to a certain extent. I mean, people, and it seems like you don't. Sometimes there's blogs that have some people on them. Sometimes Facebook groups try to do this, but it seemed like people were pretty enmeshed off of the internet.
Well, in the case of Shinet in particular, it was a local thing. Almost everybody was from Chicago and environs, so it was possible to actually get together with people on a regular basis, and we did.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, that more or less directed most of my online socializing from that point forward. I kind of used it as an accessory to local stuff rather than a substitute for local stuff.
Yeah, and you kind of get the idea too. That kind of sets a template for what your expectations are of other social stuff. Because when I started, I got to IU in '89, and we had these VAX computers, and we had a certain, and this is like 30 years before the creators of social networks were even born or something. I don't even know, but we had kind of this ragtag social network where there was Forum, which was like an online BBS where people would talk to each other. And there were like these primitive ways you could chat with people, like the VAX phone, which would open up two little screens in a chat. I guess it was like an early,
Like the predecessor of Unix Talk, I guess, or along
yeah.
with it.
Or if you want to keep the lineage, it's like kind of like the way AOL Messenger opened up, and there was something called BitNet, which is really similar to the way SMS messaging works now, of just sending one-line messages to somebody and they would pop up on their screen and you would read them. And so there was, using those tools, there was a certain amount of, and there were games too, like multi-user dungeon games and stuff, which some people were into just for the gaming aspect of killing dragons or becoming paladins or whatever. But there were also a lot of people that would just go in there and just hang out and talk to each other in the inside of the game, like a social circle. But like that was my real introduction to all that stuff. And it really kind of set up, like, I still know some of the people that I would talk to back then. And, I lived with one of my roommates, Kirk, who, he was a person that I originally met there. And, but we knew each other in the dorms. And it had that local aspect too, because these were, for the most part, all people that were at IU. And so we would have these meetups where we would go to Garcia's Pizza and on Friday and everybody would eat lunch, or, different stuff like that. And also the one-on-one, different people were hooking up and different people were, fighting or doing, there was always some political drama or whatever when you get a bunch of 19 or 20-year-olds all hooked up together. And but that kind of set the stage for that. And it's weird because like now, in midlife, I feel isolated sometimes, and I kind of think like, what is that thing now? I mean, you can't go back to the faxes or whatever, and like, what is there in the internet, the modern internet world that's like that? And as you see stuff like, there's all this discussion about like LiveJournal was that for a while. Which is mostly gone. And I know you were a big live journaler for a long
But
time.
I never used it as I never used it to meet people. I never got new people from LiveJournal. I used to read other people's journals, but there were
Yeah.
people who were already my friends for the most part. So I didn't really use it as anything like a way to meet people. It was just a way to put stuff up conveniently where my friends could read it.
Yeah, and where you could keep in touch with people too. I mean,
Right.
I think LiveJournal came out maybe 10 years after I left IU, and I still had a certain amount of relationships with people who had left IU and got, jobs elsewhere, moved elsewhere. I moved to Seattle, and people ended up in whatever, the Bay Area or the South or whatever. And I think that early era of blogging and live journaling and stuff, you could still put out there stuff of, just keeping people in touch of, I'm taking a trip to Chicago next week. I'm gonna, thinking about going back to school next year. Just like broadcasting those live events. But yeah, it did seem to kind of slowly shut down. Like there wasn't that as much interaction with it.
Well, I think LiveJournal itself had some. I never used it this way, but there was obviously a bunch of people who used it as a kind of, I think, science fiction community, or there were people for whom it was almost like a specialty message board.
Yeah.
But again, that's not how my friends and I used it, but I know this was happening at one time.
Yeah, there was a certain amount of their group stuff was pretty embryonic. I remember being in their baseball group for a little while, or whatever they called it, page community, I forget. And it worked, but it was still pretty limited. And there were a couple others that I would drift into. Like there were some for zines or for whatever.
And there were local ones that different towns or areas had going. They were all kind. I mean, they had subject communities. They tried to have subject communities, and some of them I think did take off, but nothing that I was involved with ever really did in that way.
Yeah, the one interesting one that bridges all of this is the alt.tasteless thing.
Now that's interesting, because that was a big source of friendship for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. So that came out of. Well, it came out of two places. One is it came out of Usenet, which nationally there was this group, and Usenet was divided. There was like alt groups, and what else was there? There was like rec, comp, I forget what else. And there were local ones, like there was Indiana, IU, UCS.
Sure, there were research oriented ones. There were local ones. There were broad categories of. I don't know. I think what defined the alt category was that it was less restricted than the others. There was less voting and consensus required to set up an alt group.
Yeah, I don't think there was any. I think, and it was interesting because the deal is there these Usenet servers. They were all over the world, and they would propagate between them, and you could limit the propagation on some of them. So, like if IU did one, they could limit it so only people at IU could read it. And then if you created just something crazy, it might not propagate to all servers. But then there were some, like there was, I think the big political one, or not political, but there was an alt.sex group. And there was also like alt.sex.
Especially
homosexual
raccoons, whatever,
or
right.
anal or whatever it was. And like some places, like if you were on a NASA Usenet server or you were on the State Department one or something, they wouldn't propagate that. And you just wouldn't be able to read it. But if you had it elsewhere, but that was like, of course, that was the big one. Or was it Star Trek? I mean, everything in computer science is driven by Star Trek, I think. But anyway, there was alt.tasteless, and so this was. I mean, it was international. There were people all over, but as far as people actively posting, I don't know the numbers, but there were a few dozen like daily regular posters, and there was, maybe 100, 200 people in general that were posting on and off. But if you were parked on it every day and reading the articles, you would get it. You would kind of get into the swing of you'd have a dozen or two people that you would know. And oddly enough, this forum thing that existed at IU, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 people there was a weirdness group. I think it was called Serious Weirdness or something. And there were a couple people who will remain nameless for their protection, not that they're adults, but they were on that, and they got turned on to alt tasteless. So I would always see them there. So there was some weird crossover that when I think of alt tasteless, I think of those couple people who stuck with it. And it was a big thing for a while because, I mean, it was gross out stuff, but the people, because this was all text, it was a lot more of like writing and parody and, long form jokes and people, riffing on current events and, writing things about Jeffrey Dahmer or, and I filter through like everything that was a big tragedy or serious thing in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, was all stuff that ended up becoming some kind of big, sick inside joke and all tasteless. So stuff like, the Oklahoma bombings and Jeffrey Dahmer or Susan Smith, or, all kinds of jokes about people driving their kids in the river, just like there was all this kind of stuff. But it was a very close knit community in that. And there were some people that were friends outside of it. Like they would try to have these meetups, which it was people all over the country, but everybody would try to meet in Boston or something like that. And I never managed to get to one of those, but it's funny, as Usenet died, they tried to bring that over to LiveJournal as like a private group, and it kind of went there for a while. But then there's a Facebook, like a private Facebook group, but it seemed to like degenerate over time. And it's the same with any social networking. I think, it used to be people were writing these thousands and thousands of word long essays and about jokes and like almost like mini plays, or, just whatever. And now it's down to like, here's a meme, let's post it, thumbs up, whatever. It's kind of killed the long form. So anyway, yeah, I forget about Alt Tasteless, but that was a big content generator too.
And interesting that it didn't really survive the jump to a different platform. I think a lot of online social environments don't.
Yeah.
They thrive in one place, and you just can't really haul them somewhere else.
And some of that was just with that group of people. Obviously when I was 21 and I was working a desk job and had not, then sitting and reading Usenet and getting in these giant flame wars and doing all kinds of stuff. Like I just had way more time to do that. I think even if they restored Usenet to all of its glory of 1993 now, and I, have a mortgage and I have a job and I have, whatever, I wouldn't have the same fuel to the fire.
And yet the interesting thing is that I still spend lots of time writing stuff to my friends, and I don't really care where it goes. It's more likely than not just to go to private email now, because there's no other place. There's no comparable place to put it where my friends will find it.
Yeah, and I don't even email as much anymore.
I don't either that much, but I do some, and it's gone back to one-on-one mostly for me.
Yeah, I have a couple people that I email a lot, or even almost daily. But just looking back, because I'm a hoarder and I've kept all of my email from when I was in Seattle, so I have like maybe 20 years of email sitting on a server, and I've gone back. I think the big thing was on the anniversary of 9/11. I went back and I tried to pull all the email that I sent that week and that day just to see what was going on.
I remember getting email from you that day.
Yeah. And it was just interesting because the week before, I was trying to get what my mindset was and, going into that. And I've written about this online at Rumored, but it was just interesting because I would just write these giant emails and people would reply to them. And now, you're lucky to get a sentence back from a person.
It's true.
But then it was just like pages and pages of, and this was 6 years after I left the university. So I'm still in touch with a lot of people in Indiana. And, and obviously when that happened, like everybody I knew emailed me that day and said, "Are you okay?" or "What's going on?" So, but just in general, that time period, because if I look the month before, a couple months after, or whatever, I just used to write tons and tons, and now it's, and some of it too, blogs supplanted a certain amount of that. I used to just write my trip reports or my whatever on Rumored, which Rumored just had its 20th anniversary not too long ago, but
well, my rule for that is that I do try to put something up once a month, but it's down to that now,
Yeah. It's hard because I've gone, it waxes and wanes, and right now it's a little soft, but I did try to go through, it's hard to figure out what to blog about. And sometimes I would write these kind of current events, like my thoughts on the Microsoft Surface or the whatever, some tech or what's, the apocalypse or the, whatever. I don't know.
I
But
just try to do an FYI, here's what I've been thinking about, and here's what I've been up to lately.
yeah,
It doesn't have to be, I really have no interest in having to force myself to write essays on a topic or anything.
yeah,
Just something, just something, so people can know.
yeah,
So anyone who's still curious can go find out what I'm up to if
yeah.
they need to.
My problem with that is there's just never anything up. I mean, it's
Well-
just like, I worked. I went
That's
to,
okay.
I wrote.
I'm fine with that. Hey, I saw a guy with a big beard walking down El Camino or whatever. You know?
Yeah. So, I wanted to shift to talking about writing for a little bit, and I also think it's interesting that of all my friends, I think you knew me before I identified as a writer, or before I was really.
I have a
writing.
memory of you showing me some stories before you even knew that was what you were going to do.
Yeah, I mean,
I distinctly remember that, and one of them actually turned into something that you ran with.
yeah, it's funny because I mean, I studied, and this is where I'm trying to lead to is the study of writing. But when I was at IU, I started computer science, and I got up to whatever calculus 2, and I hit the wall. And then it was like, okay, I just got to find something else to get 120 hours and get the fuck out of here. And I started taking writing classes because I was writing in the zines and stuff like that. And I took a couple of you had to take an intensive writing class, and I took one and I wrote a few essays, and that was fun. But I think I took maybe 2 or 3 fiction classes of undergrad, and I started to get a couple. I think in my whole time at IU, I got maybe 2 or 3 stories that at that point I thought, okay, these are okay. And I kind of stumbled into it, and it was really in '93 I had a really bad breakup, and then I really started writing after that, and that's when I locked in. But that was a little bit after I met you, and I still didn't have anything to show for it. It took me a little bit of time to get going until I started to.
One of those stories had the nugget of summer rain in it.
Yeah,
I remember that because it was a whole lot more vivid than the other. I think you showed me 3, and there was one of them that was obviously that obviously had a spark in it.
Yeah, and it was funny because the way that came about was, well, I was a big reader as a kid, but mostly junk science fiction and all that kind of stuff, and I never I did the certain amount of whatever the Shakespeare and Milton and whatever you had to do in high school, but I didn't have a strong literary background. I had never read Kerouac, and I never gotten into any of that stuff that I was supposed to, whatever, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, whatever. And so when I started writing and I started thinking, okay, this is what I might want to do, that's when I started to read, and where I was getting suggestions and locking in. And I think that was like when it's really stereotypical, but it's I got really obsessed with Henry Miller and Kerouac too, where it's you read this and it's oh, I can do this. I just need to get out and fuck around and, just write it all down and change the names and all that. And that's really where Summer Rain came in. And it came out of this really horrible, I think it was a 200 level fiction course. And it was it was like an MFA course that was watered down, but taught by an MFA. It was one of those kind of, a dozen people writing stories, everybody reading them, sitting in a circle and, crapping on people. And I started writing that story almost as a fuck you, because I read so many horrible stories, and I was just I'm just going to write something that I'm really pissed off about and all this. And I wrote about this. I just stumbled into writing about, being broke in the summer and trying to date somebody and not, and working at this radio station and just trying to figure out I'm sitting at this big fork in the road and I don't know what to do. And it was just, whatever, 5,000 word thing.
But I remember bits of that so clearly even now. I remember the floor of the radio station
in
that story.
Yeah, and that was what, I mean, I really wish I would have done more stuff like that. Because that was, I had about a year and then I was gone. But, I was just starting to get to that point of, just trying to capture stuff. And, I just have so much regret about when I was at IU not taking more pictures or recording stuff, recording stuff like this. I don't know what, but talking to more people and, capturing that stuff, kind of trapping it in amber, and
But you can't.
Yeah.
You've got to sift and synthesize, and you can. The problem with taking tons of pictures is that eventually you're going to have to go through and throw them out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas at least if you're writing about it, that takes a little more effort. It takes a little more doing than just capturing.
Yeah, and it's fun to look back at that stuff, but it's also, it's kind of a trap too. If you don't have that thought or that critical, because that was something in writing that story that I really had to sit down and think of, like, what doesn't go here, and what can I just preserve in the minimum amount, and just to get past it. And that was kind of the start of learning that, like, writing something like Henry Miller or whatever is not as easy as it just going out and doing it and then vomiting the words down. It's like, there's really some craft. And I feel like I didn't have the craft then, but, I was getting on that road. But I always think about that, because it's like most of the people, the people I've talked to here and other whereas I was already a writer, and there are times, especially when I feel like I need to just quit being a writer, that I think, like, okay, what did I do before I wrote?
It's funny. I don't know. I don't know if you can not be a writer. I'm inclined to think that it's a way of processing information. It's almost like an orientation to the world.
Yeah.
Either you, it may not be the way it is for everybody, but I think if you find yourself inclined to get things down in words as a way of just interacting with the world, then you are a writer, and there may be times when you're more or less productive, or there may be times when you are making things with the writing that you're doing, and other times when you're not making things. But that's not the same thing as being or not being a writer. You're a writer regardless.
Yeah.
As long as you're actually doing the writing of some sort.
Yeah.
But it's like the difference between making chairs and being a woodworker.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can be a woodworker who isn't currently working on any chairs, but you're still probably sanding.
And and I guess this is what I want to kind of ask you about, because when we first met, I don't know if you considered yourself a writer then or not. What I do remember is when we were first hanging out and stuff, is that you were definitely a bibliophile, and you definitely,
I remember giving you a whole list of things that I thought you would probably like to read. Just a ton of things, that some of which I thought you might like.
Well, I just remember when we going over your place that it's like, because I was just starting to buy books and get into it, because I think prior to that year, other than computer science books, I had a dozen books that followed me around from place to place. But that was when I was like, okay, I need to buy books and have books and surround myself. And I know your place, you had just what at the time to me seemed like just an insurmountable number of books.
Which is pretty hilarious, because the house I grew up in was completely lined with them. And what I had was a miniature subset of what I grew up with. So I got all that for free, basically, growing up.
But you weren't, it was interesting, because obviously the jobs that we were doing, writing this content for the university, and you'd previously worked other gigs like that, doing like PR marketing and, that kind of writing, but that's the chair making and not the woodworking, I guess. So like fast forward a ways here, and, you came out to California first. And I guess at what point did you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to go in whole hog as far as school and all that?
Well, let me think. I'm not even sure. I have always written, not in the sense of making things, but in the sense of just getting words down. I've done that pretty much all my life from when I first actually knew how to wield a pencil. There were times when I was making things, and there were times when I was just doing it. I guess the first time I had always written bits and pieces, and sometimes they made their way into actual stories, but I never felt that they were done, or they would be or that they would be things that might be of interest to someone else. I thought, well, to hell with this. Let's see if I can make something of interest to somebody else. Mm-hmm. That was, I guess, probably about 2 years in after landing in California.
Yeah, and when did you come out here?
I came out here at the beginning of, between Christmas 03 and New Year's 04. So I was at the beginning of 04. And I guess it was in 06 that I decided I would take a story to a Stanford workshop.
Okay.
And I did, and that was fun. It turned out to be a whole lot of fun. People liked the story better than I thought they would.
And how does the Stanford thing work? I mean, was this an extension thing or?
Yeah, at that time they didn't have any kind of sustained program. I mean, aside from they have the equivalent of a graduate program, which is their Stegner Fellowship program. But they had, other than that, they just had continuing ed classes, which were very good. Many of them were run by this woman Nancy Packer, who's a terrific teacher, and other people, friends and proteges of hers, and various Stegner fellows who were doing this as a part-time gig. They were pretty decent workshops. They were grossly expensive, which is a downside, but so is everything around here.
Yeah.
Anyway, I took one of them, found it was a pretty good experience. The class had, I don't know, I think nominally 17, practically speaking, maybe 20 people in it.
Yeah.
And there are always a few extras. And in a class that size, you can usually get 3 or 4 good readers.
Yeah.
And that was interesting. And it was also interesting to see what other people came up with and how what people's attempts. It was just I had not been around a whole class full of other writers before. This was a new thing for me. I realized a bunch of things. I realized that a lot of people don't have a lot of fluency. That if you've grown up writing, or if you've put in your however many hours Malcolm Gladwell's book claims you need to develop expertise in a thing, if you haven't done that, you might have some really good ideas, but they're going to sound clunky and awkward.
Yeah.
But that's fixable. That's fixable. These people will be able to fix their clunky awkwardness problems, maybe. But even if they don't, the ideas are interesting. And they're interesting to me in that they are a glimpse into how other people see the world and what other people think is worth describing about the world.
Yeah.
Even if I know that the story they're writing is never going to turn into a thing another person is going to want to read. It's still interesting to me to see what they wanted to do.
And what kind of mix of people, women, were these people that previously had published or grad people?
Mostly not. Mostly they were a lot of retired Stanford people.
Okay.
And I'd say probably about half retired Stanford people and half a complete mix of other people from around the Bay Area.
Just people out
some
of tech,
coming from a distance, people out of tech, people out of whatever, people straight out of undergrad, some even high school students, a big range of people with a preponderance of sort of retired Stanford types.
And was it strictly writing, or was there reading other than I imagine you read other people's stories?
Yes, there was. We read other people's stories. There were conventionally the classes broke down in a pretty predictable way. There would be stories selected because they had a good example of some technical feature or other, and you were supposed to read that and think about that. Generally speaking, they didn't match up with the stories that people brought in. People just brought whatever they wanted to workshop. But I did take a couple of classes from a woman called Alice Laplante, which were taught in a different way, in a generative and fascinating way. She would have you read a story, find in that story a few technical things that you noticed about that story, and then try something, not much, 2,000 words max. Bring in something that used that feature, the feature that you found and were interested in the story that she had assigned.
Oh, okay. So you'd read Tim O'Brien, Things They Carried or something, and then you'd be like, oh, I want to write something that uses that kind of descriptive prose of...
Or uses lists or something like
that.
His
lists, yeah.
Or whatever. I mean, she had a whole set of examples that she found, that she had found over the years, people sprang off well from. And that was the first class that I took that I think focused on craft in a way that was useful to me in particular.
Mm-hmm. So, how far did you go with the Stanford thing?
Oh, I took a bunch of classes there, but after a point, they become fairly similar. I found it frustrating to have to stop after 10 weeks or whatever the length of the class was, because it seemed to take that long just to get comfortable with the group and figure out who was doing what and to understand enough about people's intentions to be able to write something helpful to them. That is, as soon as things were getting rolling, we had to quit. And I thought it would be fun to work in a more sustained way with people. And so I applied to an MFA program and got into the Warren Wilson one, which was terrific, actually, which was it's a low residency program, which means you don't really have to quit your job. I couldn't do that. I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it was a good possibility.
And the Warren Wilson program, what is
Well, it's not workshop based. I mean, we do some workshops during the residencies, but let me go back a step. There are residencies twice a year, which are basically like writing camp for grown-ups. But the bulk of the program is what happens in between the residencies, where you work one-on-one with an advisor.
Okay.
You email back and forth every period, and I'm trying to remember, was it every 3 weeks? Every period, you have to send them about 30 pages of stuff, plus a couple of short essays of a type that we call annotations. And you, again, what you worked on was completely between you and your advisor, but you did end up having to crank out a body of material and a set of short essays every time, and collect them up at the end of the semester for your credit.
Okay. And the residencies were in.
The residencies were in North Carolina, in a rural campus, which was it's kind of an interesting rural hippie school called Warren Wilson. Actually, a cousin of mine went there as an undergrad, and that was how I knew about it to begin with. But they have that, and I think maybe one other graduate program. The MFA program is not terribly well integrated with the rest of the school. It's almost like a separate entity entirely. The undergrads are gone when we're there, and the people teaching come from everywhere because it doesn't occur. Again, the residencies are easy to go to even if you have other full-time commitments. So my first advisor also teaches at Columbia. Most of the other advisors had other teaching jobs elsewhere, and it's a pretty intense couple of weeks, or it's actually just 10 days, but it's a pretty intense time. The business of figuring out who your advisor is going to be is always sort of hair-raising. It's like the Harry Potter sorting hat. It happens the first second day you're there.
Yeah.
And at some point very early on, and the faculty get everybody's workshop stories ahead of time and read and figure out among them who's going to work with whom. So they pick you, basically.
Oh, okay.
You can.
A little scary.
It is a little scary, and it's kind of funny.
It's like a little league or the playground getting picked last for dodgeball or something.
Well, except we don't hear how they negotiate all this, and it's everybody.
They negotiate between themselves.
They negotiate among themselves who's going to work with whom.
Okay.
So there comes a meeting on your second day when the matchups are posted on a wall,
Wow.
which is always very exciting, and there's always also. At almost every residency, there's somebody there who hasn't taught there before, and so nobody's worked with them before, and they have no idea if they've not heard any rumors.
Yeah.
What the person is like.
And you have a different one each, I guess.
Each semester.
Any of note that you want to name drop?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I worked with a lot of interesting people. Some of them you've probably heard of, some of them you probably haven't. My first semester advisor was Victor Laval, who's just done a big graphic novel. He's a fun guy. He I think kind of mistakenly picked a story of mine because it had there was a UFO connection in that story, and I think his ears perked up at that because he's really into horror, and I didn't want to take the story in the direction he really wanted to push it in, but we had fun anyway.
Yeah,
and he was a great guy to work with. He, interestingly enough, he's used to having to prompt people into generating stuff, and he insisted that I try just taking a situation and running with it, just writing reams of prose in the kind of just don't start with any ideas, just vomit it out. Didn't work for me at all. I can do that anyway. I've been doing that all my life.
Yeah.
It was no help. I can happily for hours and hours write about some guy who's walking to the university surplus place to get an old bookshelf for his sister, and you know, and I can describe every damn thing he sees and everything. I have no problem doing that. This is not what I need, but it took us. I didn't know what Victor had in mind by having me do this, so I couldn't really say, Victor, look, this is something I've already got down. Okay,
yeah.
We wasted a lot of time writing writing a story that basically had mountains of detail nobody needs.
Yeah.
Because again, this is not my problem. My problem is actually making a thing that has an intention and then it gets tied off somewhere.
Yeah, I could definitely see me the same because I mean that's all I do especially now that I'm not on a project is I mean I just sit down every day and regurgitate, guy walking to whatever through weird stuff or whatever. It's like I don't
Need help with that, thank you.
I don't have a problem, loading firewood into the train. I need to know where to build the tracks.
Exactly.
And how the tracks are supposed to end and how to, whatever. I mean,
so my first semester was just like that. It was I guess this is almost back to the old Stanford problem. I think it took Victor and me an entire semester to learn how to work with each other, and then it was time to move on to somebody else.
Yeah.
But it was a fun experience. And the interesting thing too is that he had got some sort of fellowship to go do film school in Amsterdam at the same time that he was working with me as an advisor.
Oh.
And
weird.
this was actually pretty cool because he was learning film techniques, which he'd never had to think about as a writer.
Yeah.
That is, zero access to people's interior thoughts.
Yeah.
And he was full of ideas like, what's the guy got in his pocket?
Yeah, or how to show it. Or I imagine, I mean, this is a guess, but just like working on film stuff like that, there's probably a lot more kind of the worry of efficiency and how to, get the raw material down without, I mean, because with a book, you can just sit and dick around for years and years of just writing this stuff down. But like when you have a film, it's like, okay, we have this place booked for a day and we have to get this guy here and we have to, whatever, you have to think about that. And then, maybe when you're editing, you can jog the stuff around. But the practicality of doing that, because that's one thing that I wish I could learn more with writing. And I've seen writers that work like this is, just the precision of being able to stay on something and just get this done, as opposed to just wandering like I do.
Well, exactly. And again, I think it took us that long to figure out what we could do together, and then it was time to switch.
Yeah.
But that's okay. That in itself is an interesting feature of the program. That is, you work with very different people, and often they have very different ideas of what your work should do.
Yeah.
And it's, if nothing else, even my last 2 semesters there, I had advisors who differed drastically on what one of my thesis stories should have, whether there should be a certain confrontation scene in one of my thesis stories. One advisor said absolutely yes, build it up, and the other one said no, it's far better without. And the jury is still out on that one. I've got both versions, and I haven't really made up my mind which I prefer. They had extremely strong opinions.
And one of yours, Shields, was there when you?
Yeah, David Shields. I'm still thinking about a lot of what he said. He had just recently said in some interview shortly before the semester began when I was working with him that he really wasn't a fan of fiction anymore.
Yeah.
So, David, why are you teaching in a fiction program?
I mean, he said that in like every interview with
yeah.
the what was the book, the 2012 one? That was just the pieces of the. I'm blanking out.
I'm blanking out too, but he said, well, let me see if I can remember how he summed this up, because it was hilarious and it was just sort of great. He said, well, there's a thing that people do when they write fiction. You work up an image system, end on a moment of thematic revelation, and you're done. And he said he was bored with that. It wasn't of interest to him. He said that he finds that a lot of fiction is disingenuous, that you're in a sense masking your real concerns. There are things that you want to think about, things that you want to write about, and you are using made-up people to avoid having to face them in your own life.
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair. It's I like the freedom not to have to stick to truth. I like to be able to make up different professions for people if that underlines something better. I like to make up different locations. I like to be able to take big liberties with the truth. But I don't really want to write essays without the freedom to exaggerate where I need to.
Yeah. Reality Hunger is the book.
Yeah, Reality Hunger.
And which was 2010.
He also said, your notes for the project are probably the project.
That's interesting.
And that is interesting, and in fact, I've had to come back to that over and over again.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's funny because I usually don't do notes for a book.
I don't do notes exactly, but what I do is sketchy stuff. I wouldn't describe it as outlines exactly. I would describe it as a lot of fragmenty things. I do a lot of fragmenty writing that I then have to fill in, and then I have to go back and fill in some blanks. It's not outlines. It's just it's just bits and pieces of observations that need a little bit of glue.
Yeah.
They need a lot of glue, actually.
The one book, I don't know if you read it, but that book, The Memory Hunter, that I wrote in
Yep,
2014,
I did.
that was the one exception of the rule, and I think I wrote that mostly as a fuck you to people who said, why are you writing this nonlinear crap? But that I actually I had an idea, and then I turned that into like a 20-word elevator pitch, and then I turned that into like a 14-step, one line per outline, and then each of those lines became like a one paragraph outline, and then those kind of got became the beginnings of chapters. And so I bet if I did go back and look at those notes, and I did, I did all on the computer, and I use this program Scapel that it's like a flowcharty type thing. But yeah, I bet if I just looked at that, it would probably be more interesting than the book itself. But so yeah. And do you want to talk about your one person that was in your class?
Oh, well, I can't really say anything useful about him. But pretty much everybody who's been in an MFA program has encountered this one guy, this renowned actor who likes
From
to
Palo Alto.
who likes to at least for a while liked enrolling in MFA programs. Some of them he finished, some of them he didn't. He got through poetry at our place and started in fiction but didn't finish. He he didn't stay. He was the only person. No, he was one of three people who didn't stay on campus. The other two actually lived in Asheville. So he stayed at a hotel which was not close by. I mean, this place is in the middle of the woods, right? So there really wasn't
Yeah.
a hotel that was super close by. But he would actually drive in the morning and often show up late and sit on the floor. He liked sitting on the floor, not on one of those folding chairs. I can't blame him. They were not comfortable chairs. He was also the first person I saw taking notes on a tablet, incidentally.
Huh.
But I have nothing to say about his writing because I was never in any kind of workshop with him.
Yeah.
He really hated when people... No one quite knew how to talk to him. Nobody wanted to not to say things to him that would make him uncomfortable. Everybody felt kind of sorry for him.
So you had like a combination of like, what the hell are you doing here? Plus like, because I know when I was in New York, I mean, I worked in a big building with a lot of celebrities, and
Right.
there's the whole New York celebrity thing where you say hey, and you don't say, oh my God, you're whoever.
So what we all tried to do, and we used to talk about this sometimes when he wasn't around, which was pretty much always. But we would try to talk to him the way we would say the same things we would say to anybody else. So who are you working with this semester? Oh, I had him last time. He was great. Or wow,
Yeah.
that should be fun. And then and then people would just have nothing to say to him at all after that because almost anything seemed like it might put him in a bad position.
Yeah. It's interesting. If you read Zeroville,
No.
you know of it though.
Nope. What is Zeroville?
Erickson. It's a really good book. I'll throw a link of it online, but it's an interesting book. Well, two things. One is that the aforementioned person we're talking about did a film version of it, which is stuck with. I think it's been filmed, but it hasn't been released, and he has other films coming out, so I don't know. It's log jammed somewhere. But the book is great, but it takes place in the early 70s in Hollywood. And it's about some weird prodigy film editor that shows up, and he has all these personal things, but he's interacting in this world of kind of the new cinema and, just, Coppola and Scorsese and Milius and De Niro and all these people. And so he weaves between he's a film critic for LA, I think LA Weekly, LA Times. So there's a lot of film. It's very film heavy, the book, but it's also mostly this guy's journey and how he's going insane and all this other stuff. But what's interesting about it, aside from the fact that this person is doing the film and is playing the main character in it, is that the book talks about all these famous people, but it does not use their names, and it doesn't specifically, like he talks about John Milius, who's the guy that wrote Apocalypse Now and the Conan movies, and he's kind of a right-wing blowhard and well known in Hollywood. But he never says John Milius. He calls him like the old Viking. And
funny.
And
Okay.
as you're reading it, you're reading the old Viking, and then you're like, oh wait, he's talking about barbarian movies, and he's talking about going to the Philippines to write some book that's a ripoff of Hard Darkness. And then it's like, oh yeah, he's John. So
does the character not have a fictional name at all, but just this
well,
epithet?
the main character is fictional, but he's interacting with all these people who are, Hollywood producers or starlets or Margot Kidder is in it, but he never calls her Margot Kidder. He has a brief romantic thing, but he never calls her that. And so, but like as a film buff or a consumer, you don't need to be a buff, but you start to think like, oh, that's so and so. They were working on this film, and this is he's talking about De Niro. He's talking about Taxi Driver and the guy in the Mohawk. Oh yeah, that's De Niro. So, but he doesn't. It's kind of ingenious in how he doesn't do that. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation about this person that we're not mentioning, and it's kind of the same thing as the film that he's going to be in. So, let's talk about UFOs.
Well, back to the story that Victor Laval wanted to work on with me. The character in that story had seen something as a kid, and he'd been worrying about it on and off for the rest of his life. Not that just that a big formative experience that he'd had was something that he knew lots of people would think he was a nut if he were to explain to them.
Yeah. And that's a common, it's not common, but it is a kind of a trope.
Well, it's a problem. It's a
yeah.
Let's completely leave aside the question of what these people did or didn't see. The fact that there is a memory that they have that is blatantly unacceptable to most people is a problem. It's a big obstacle in your life.
Sure, and it's you can go in different angles off of that as far as I got stuck in a big K-hole about the satanic panic stuff of the 80s and did a bunch of reading about that. But that's also something that it's like, there's some belief that none of that has really happened, and that it was, the influence of, false hypnosis and all that kind of stuff. And that, really most of those daycare centers that got busted weren't doing. It's like even the same thing as like politically, and I don't want to get into politics, but like the whole Pizzagate thing that's going on now and all that. But it's like kind of the flip side of the UFO thing is, yeah, are you crazy, or did it really happen? And even there was a documentary I just watched, and I wish I knew the name of it because it was about 6 months ago and it's already out of my head. But somebody did a documentary about the people within the government that show up at like these MUFON meetings and stuff like that, both to gather intelligence, but also to kind of blow things up with kind of false positives, or, put out different smoke to, like there were divisions of the government that kind of infiltrate these groups and, throw out false propaganda and stuff, or make the people look crazier and all that kind of stuff. And I'll have to look that up. I'll have to email you about that later or mention it. But it was a fascinating documentary because, it started out with people who were observers or who thought they saw this stuff. And then it got into people that had worked for the CIA and specifically went to these things as like almost like COINTELPRO stuff, and said, yeah, we just made shit up, and we, try to lead them off. And it almost reminds you of like now how they have these people that are like trying to radicalize people, kids, and say, hey, you need to buy a bomb off of us and bring it to the airport. And, they sell them a fake bomb, and then they go to the airport and arrest them. And, like not that dramatic, but it's like the same kind of.
Well, let's assume just for the sake of argument that there is information about extraterrestrial or interdimensional, if you prefer, entities who have, and that there is physical evidence that's being concealed.
Yeah.
Let's just take that as a hypothesis and jump off from there. If it's if there is an effort to discredit people coming forward with strange ideas by making them seem nuttier than they are, how is it going to be possible when that ceases to be sustainable? How do you try to keep a lid on the panic and craziness that would ensue if that information were to get out?
Well, yeah.
I ask this because my dad thinks that something happened in 1992 that was an attempt to do the opposite, to, in a sense, begin very gradually and very slowly to legitimize the release of some information about the UFO phenomenon. That was a conference at Temple University in Philadelphia in 1992 that was, my dad thinks, overfunded and over-respectably attended. Pretty much everyone there had some sort of university scientific affiliation. It was, as conferences go, it was a little too lush. Somebody was paying for it, and it was as respectable as could be. There were metallurgists and geologists there talking.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, my hypothesis on this, to back up, was always that, I mean, we know the government had stuff in Nevada that they didn't want people to find out about. The B-2 bomber, the F-117, all kinds of drones and stealth stuff, and there's all kinds of stuff that we know now was developed out there at Grim Lake, and that was flown, and that later became conventional weapons. But that in periods during the Soviet era and during the 60s and 70s and stuff, the government didn't want people to find out about that. So when there were people sitting out there with binoculars and in whatever, looking at this stuff, whether or not they were thinking this is a UFO or that the government's up to something, or we're spending trillions of dollars on planes and whatever it was, nuclear weapons or something, there was some distraction there, just the same as if, somebody found the Pentagon Papers and decided, hey, we need to find out how to make sure this guy looks like he's got screw loose or whatever. But yeah, I think when you go a step beyond that and you start to hypothesize, there's more out there. But what you said is interesting, because aside from, I mean, there's the simple scalability, or like a given, in the 60s, that one person would find out, or two would find out, or they would meet or have meetings, or, publish newsletters, or, do a film or show up on TV or something. But then the scalability of that falls apart, like when the internet comes up, and like anybody can create these online groups and can put the stuff out there and anybody can find it. And obviously, like, one of the things, aside from, tasteless jokes and information on how to set up your email, one of the things I remember blowing up big in the mid 90s was all the conspiracy stuff and all the UFO groups and all of the, not only that, but I mean, what is the government doing, the Iran Contras and then all the Clinton stuff and the white, all the, all that stuff, and whatever, Vince Foster and, all that, whatever, black helicopters. But it makes you wonder too, of like, would the strategy there be to dilute that stuff as much as possible, so it just look like you don't know what you can trust? Are they just going to pump out so much false information that the people that do come forward with real information just seem like, yeah, that's another GeoCities page, ignore that? And they do. I mean, we know the government does a certain amount of this stuff in other countries. I mean, there are groups within the government that just sit on Twitter and monitoring and posting stuff in foreign countries, for ISIS recruitment stuff, and trying to track people down. And even back in the day of, Voice of America Radio and all these fake newspapers and, stuff that went on in Europe or in Central America. I mean, the government has a track record of that stuff. It's just a matter of how much of it is, going on now.
Well, who knows? All I can say is that my dad is reasonably confident that some of the reports that people make cannot be explained by conventional means, and that some of these people are clearly not crazy,
Yeah, and that's one thing. I mean, your dad, who's Don Donderi, and you can find him all over the internet. He has a book, and one of the things that always interested me about your dad's stuff is that he did not. One is that he was kind of a rationalist of, he has a science background. He has he's worked on what was it, the B-52 thing back in the day of the, he has,
He's done navigation systems of various sorts.
yeah, but he's a scientist. He's not just some guy in his garage. He seems to have like a rational background. I mean, if you start his book at the beginning, he's really talking about, could this be something else? Is it swamp gas? Is it, what?
Well, sure, some of the reports are completely explainable as one thing or another, but not all of them.
Yeah, and that's what I liked, is that how he lays a foundation down of, there are certain things that we can believe, and then how do we, go from there? And, how much of this is rationally stuff we can explain or stuff we didn't know, and then we go on from there. So that's what I thought was interesting going into his stuff, is that he didn't seem like a crackpot.
No, he's very much not a crackpot. He has to deal with crackpots and work with crackpots and talk to crackpots, and I kind of grew up with very comfortable with crackpots because I've known them all my life. But
yeah, I mean, that's kind of the envious thing of, it seems like, because he does a certain amount of travel or conference stuff. I know he's appeared at these things, and it's always, I mean, I'm very limited. I should go to some MUFON meetings and see what happens, but yeah, but the thought of how what goes on at those, or what different kind of people you could meet. I mean, it seems like that's perfect short story fodder.
I've only been to one, and it was really kind of made for you because it was a conference in Vegas. This was a couple of summers ago. I guess the summer of 2013. And most of the people I met there were pretty reasonable, but some of them would occasionally just sort of let their hair down and speculate about what they thought was going on, and it was odd.
Yeah.
And, to say the least. I hope they're wrong.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. I just hope these people are wrong. Some of them, anyway.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, the more you get into it, the more. I mean, for me, I'm pretty agnostic about things, and I guess I'm a skeptic at heart. I mean, I'm a skeptic about everything. I don't even know how I'm going to make it to work tomorrow. But, so it's, what are the UFOs, or where are they? But it's interesting because it's just the more that I read about it and the more I look at it, the more I realize I really don't know.
No, I know. And it's not really possible to know. And you can't really write much off. Keep Occam's razor in mind,
Yeah.
And
is your dad working on any more stuff, or is he?
Occasionally he teaches a continuing ed class for McGill in UFOs. He's not doing it right now, but he's done that a couple of times, and does lectures here and there.
Huh. Yeah, I saw he was on the news on YouTube. I saw one clip. I'll hunt that down.
He was wondering if he should do a specifically produced lecture series on YouTube. It would be a big deal. He's not sure he's going to, but it's something that he's been turning around as a possibility.
Yeah, or do a podcast.
Oh, that's a thought.
Or
I'll call him up.
Yeah, get him in here. Yeah, cool. Okay, well, I think we're gonna wrap up here, but right. I don't know what you have any plans as far as story stuff, or you're still.
Actually, I've been of late, in the interest of keeping things very specific and very tight. I've been working on things, not poems, but based on sort of poem prompts, as an exercise, writing lots of little things that are neatly tied off and whose function and purpose is strictly limited.
Yeah. When did you finish your MFA?
When was that? I guess that was the beginning of 2014.
Okay.
So it's been a while. I've not been making a whole lot of chairs since then, but I'm making little teeny tiny chairs now, dollhouse-sized chairs.
And would you recommend it?
Yes. It's not an unqualified yes, but yes. Yeah. It was a good experience for me. It was not. There's a lot that other people got out of it that I didn't. I didn't have the kind of, oh, these are my people experience that some people did. I've
Yeah.
always known writers. I've known writers all my life. It's not a kind of rare and wonderful thing for me to be surrounded by writers. It's nice, but it's not life changing. But it was great. It was good. It was good to have smart people focusing on my work and helping me out and figuring out. And the whole goal of this program really is how to use your own writing to solve, how to use your own reading to solve your problems.
Yeah.
And that's it. I'd say that with that in mind, the program succeeds pretty well.
Yeah. And you didn't have any ideas of, I mean, you don't teach writing. You didn't take the academic.
Right. It
Route.
hasn't changed my life in any enormous way.
Yeah.
But it was certainly worth doing.
Were there people in that program that were doing it with the kind of career track in mind?
Yes, there were, and they're on the case.
Yeah.
It's worked out for them pretty well.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think we hit everything for today.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thanks a lot.